Hi everyone, Dr. Stringer is back to talk to you today about policing drugs. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into this. And first thing we'll look at when we talk about policing drugs is kind of the trend in drug arrests over time. Um, so, if you look in 1980, you had about 600,000 drug arrests. In 05, you went up to 1.8 million, and then 2018 actually went down a little bit to 1.6 million. And then you'll see the breakdown here of how much of this. So out of this 1.6, 1.4 million of these drug arrests are for just possession of some sort of drug, right? So um, possession of cocaine, possession of marijuana. It didn't involve sales or trafficking or anything like that. You see, about 600,000, round up about 700,000 of this 1.6 million is just for marijuana. So, we can see that if we eliminate this marijuana arrest, that will reduce arrests significantly, right? And about 600 or 608, 608,000, 609, if you round up, are for just simple marijuana possession. It wasn't any. Now, a situation like this in the van, you wouldn't call this simple marijuana possession. Um, Obviously, this person has so much that that's obviously intent to distribute, and so that would not be a simple possession. Simple possession would be just, a little bit of weed for your personal use. Anyway, so here's kind of the trend since 2002. To look at it, it actually it peaked in about '06 and it started to go down. And then it hit a low point right around 2015 and it's actually started to go up since then. So that's an interesting thing to think about the increases in drug arrests over time. Um, so looking at police and the war on drugs, there's about, as you saw, about a million people are arrested each year for drug offenses. Uh, the drug rates for possession increased about 89% in the 80s, which is not a big surprise. The 80s was the height of kind of the drug war and all of that stuff going on. Um, Drug trafficking arrest rates increased by 210%. So they really trying to go after drug arrests. So in the UCR in 2011, about 82% were arrested for drug use or possession. This didn't involve any kind of sales or anything like that. And this is true pretty much year to year and pretty consistent that the vast majority of drug arrests are for simple possession of drugs, not for selling drugs or trafficking them or any of this more serious stuff. Most of it is this. A typical offender is a white male in the mid 20s, so you all should be careful. Those of you that are white males in your mid 20s, I'm sure some of you are in your mid 20s, given that you're undergraduate students. Um, anyway, um, there have been racial disparities. It probably doesn't come to as a big surprise to you in drug arrests, and so Black Americans have been substantially have higher rates of arrest than white Americans. Arrest rates for whites also increased from 2080 to or two, sorry 1980 to 2006, but the rate for Black Americans increased by 271% compared to 135% for white Americans. Um, so we want to think about explaining, the increase in arrest rates for drug offenses. There's two possible explanations. It could just be a dramatic increase in the number of users and sellers, right? That makes sense. Maybe more people are using drugs. Um, the data tends to say, well, maybe it's more law enforcement, right? Maybe we're cracking down on it more than we used to. So various policies and practice is encourage law enforcement agencies to target users and sellers. And the vast majority of arrests that police officers are making are actually for drug arrests. It's easier to find someone possessing drugs than it is to catch the serial killer or the murderer and stuff like that. And those offenses are very rare too, luckily, which is a good thing. Um, arrests increased because drug use increased. And let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into that. So the assessment of drug use may be misleading, right? There's kind of a lack of reliable data. We don't really know all of these things, and we talk about something called the dark figure of crime, right? Which you've probably heard about, which is all these crimes that we don't know about. So we know about the crimes that are reported to the police. We know about the crimes that the police make an arrest on, but of the crimes in the country that are taking place, this is a very small fraction of them. Drug offenses, especially. Uh, in some other classes, I go into showing how some crimes are more likely to be reported than others, particularly like auto theft and things like that, because people have to report the auto stolen in order to get the insurance money. So those things tend to have a lower dark figure of crime because people tend to report it more often than drug offenses. It's just nearly impossible to count all of the times that people possess drugs and use drugs throughout the entire country. These offenses would just be astronomical, and so just looking at the number of people that are arrested is not really a particularly good measure of how many people are using drugs. It tends, in my opinion, to measure more enforcement efforts, how much the police are focusing on arresting drug offenders. So anyway, uh, we can kind of get at some of this stuff by using self-reported data to go out and survey people and ask them how often they use drugs and stuff like that. So that's one of the ways. The monitoring the future data looks at high school students and sometimes younger grades as well to ask them about their drug use, so you can kind of get a picture of how many people in high school are using drugs. But that doesn't really tell you about the entire rest of the population. So that's a good thing um, to know. And one thing to think about is drug offenses don't usually come to the attention of the police unless they result in arrest. Usually, if the police officer knows that someone has drugs, then there's going to be an arrest, right? Except in the rare instance, in some places nowadays where they might not make an arrest for a simple possession of marijuana or something like that, and they just take it and send them on their way or something like that. Anyway, um, but did arrests increase as a result of changes in policies and practices? Well, uh, those of you that have taken theory have probably heard of Wilson and Keeling's broken windows theory with regard to policing and how they think that if you focus on more order maintenance, policing, maintaining order, and enforcing these kind of victimless crimes such as vagrancy, drugs, prostitution, and loitering, then that will decrease the more serious crimes. Uh, this has not really been shown to be true in most cases. However, when the police do think this, they do tend to go and arrest more people for these minor offenses, as you can imagine. Um, and so this would target individuals who were selling, possessing, or smoking even small amounts of marijuana. It's kind of what we talk about in policing is what is known as zero tolerance policing. Also, is you'll get arrested for even these small marijuana possession things. They might seem rather trivial, but what happens is they think that this is going to decrease um, the more serious crimes, like I said. One of the big drawbacks of this is it takes police officers off the street and actually causes some issues with police personnel and how they're distributing their resources. So, for example, whenever you have a police officer that has to take somebody all the way downtown for a minor marijuana offense, then that's one less police officer that you have out on the street to actually be dealing with these more serious crimes. That's one less police officer that if another officer has need for backup that is there to go and help him. And I've seen this happen in some departments. And interestingly, there's one department in Virginia I know of that I used to work closely with where they stopped arresting anyone for drunk in public and for minor crimes because they couldn't spare the police officers to drive them all the way downtown from that area because it was a very high crime area. And they said, we just can't do this. It's too dangerous for officer safety. We're stretching our resources too thin. We're getting too many calls as it is, and we can't afford to lose one of the few officers that we have in this area to take people downtown for minor offenses. And so you see that starting to happen in some departments as well. I think it's a good idea to figure out how you're going to stretch your resources because there are a limited number of resources that the police have. They have a limited number of cars and officers on each shift, and things like that. There's also a limited number of space in the jail, right? So these are all things to think about as well. Um, so stop and frisk procedures, this kind of gets into a little bit of that because officers, if they are conducting a frisk of someone and then they feel what they believe to be a crack pipe, marijuana pipe, or even bags of, you can feel little bags of crack pretty easily in someone's pocket. If you can feel that when you're just patting them down, then that gives you then probable cause to go and search that person and pull out these items. And so this does happen in many situations. And that's why you'll often hear of people putting their drugs in their shoe or their sock or something like that. And that is because if the police are patting you down for weapons, they might not be able to feel it if it's in your shoe. Now, if you have a big bulge in your sock, they're going to be able to feel that, right? And people have ankle holsters and things like that, so that's one area that they're going to pat down, especially since they know that people put drugs in their socks. Um, it's a common misbelief that the police can't make you take off your shoes for a search. If they have probable cause to search you, they can make you take off your shoes. Now, if they're just frisking you for weapons under a stop and frisk procedure, then they can't. So take that to mean what you will. And these stop and frisks are constitutional, and you've probably heard about the Courier versus Ohio case, so I won't go into a great deal of detail there since this isn't criminal procedure. But essentially, there were two men that were standing outside of a bank that kept pacing back and forth, and it was summertime, and they're wearing these big coats, which was very suspicious because why would anybody be wearing a big winter coat when it's 90 degrees outside? Anyway, the officers thought this was weird and went over and talked to them. Turns out they were hiding a bunch of automatic weapons underneath the coat, and then they were getting ready to go and rob the place. And the court in this case, from the Supreme Court, said that it was constitutional to stop them and frisk them and find out if they had weapons on them. So that's where that all comes from. There have been some issues with this in New York City, such as Floyd versus New York in 2013, where they were saying that, and they found evidence to believe that the police were essentially just stopping and frisking all people that were minorities, all black and brown people in the city. And this is unconstitutional, right? You can't just stop everybody. It's racial profiling, right? So I won't go into a great deal about that. But anyway, the prior mayor of New York City, I think it was Giuliani, was actually fighting this ruling from the courts. And what happened is then Giuliani lost the election to De Blasio, and then when De Blasio took office, he said, "Fine, we'll go with this. This is not a big deal," because they were saying that essentially the court had said that they wanted them to use body cameras and keep a record of all the stops and frisks that took place. And De Blasio said that sounds reasonable. We can do that. But I think it was. Giuliani, but I don't remember off the top of my head, so don't quote me on that. But the mayor before de Blasio took office. Don't worry, that's not on your test. Um, just to let you know, I don't ever test you all on things that I don't know off the top of my head. So if I'm giving you a lecture and I don't remember something, then I will not put it on your test because if I don't know it, then I don't expect you all to. Anyway, um, so, criticisms of stop and frisks. Obviously, the racial profiling issue is an issue, stereotyping and bias. Unreasonable to assume that people feel free to walk away because do people really feel free to walk away when the police say, "Hey, you come here"? I don't think so. Although some people do, and then they chase you, right? So it kind of supports that argument that you're not really free to walk away. Anyway, and it does allow the police to kind of freely target anyone and search them for drugs. But like I said, in the stop and frisk, it's supposed to just be patting them down, not going into their pockets and things like that. Now, if they feel something, like I said, when they're patting you down, like they feel a gun, then of course, then they're allowed to go in and retrieve it, or they feel drugs. And there's a lot of controversy over whether they can tell that things are drugs or not through the pockets and things like that. But anyway, pretextual traffic stops is another one, and they have said a couple of times in Wren versus U.S. and in Illinois versus Cabales that pretextual stops are constitutional as long as there is an actual reason to stop the person. So in this case, what happens is usually the person's in a high drug area, or maybe they saw them leave from a drug house or something like that, and the police will say, well, I think that they've probably got some drugs while they were there, so I want to stop them. They can't just stop them for that, but they can follow you for a while, and pretty much you all know that nobody drives exactly the speed limit, and if they follow you for long enough, eventually you're going to make a traffic violation. And so the Supreme Court has said that as long as the reason for the stop is that traffic violation, and they actually did commit it, then it's okay for them to have some pretextual reason for wanting to stop the person. So, drug courier profiles is another big one. And this happens, there are issues usually at the airport or near the border where people are being profiled. And I've always found this to be interesting. And so your book, as I recall, your book had some weird stuff in it for the drug courier profile. And I don't recall exactly what they said, but I thought it was very strange that it seemed like pretty much everybody would fit the criteria of it. But anyway, so I put this stuff up here, which is kind of comes from the DEA and their actual drug courier profile, which I think is a little bit more accurate. And so there are 7 basic characteristics. You're arriving from a source city, so you're flying from Miami or Colombia or something like that, where drugs are generally trafficked. You don't have any luggage. There's a rapid turnaround on the airplane trip, so maybe you flew from Miami to Colombia, but you only stayed for one night and then you flew right back. That's a big red flag, right? You use an assumed name, like not your real name. Of course, that's a big one. If you're in possession of large amounts of cash, if you pay cash for your ticket, that's another big red flag. And if you're nervous in your appearance, like obviously, if you got somebody with all of these things here, that would be kind of grounds to maybe stop them and say, hey, what's going on here? And it tends to be that when you stop people, they get even more nervous. And so, these are things that the TSA and other agents that are looking for drug couriers look for. And so these are things to think about. And the courts, as you see over here, have said that, this is pretty reasonable, right? To stop people, based upon this drug courier profile. But they have said that fitting this profile alone may not satisfy the reasonable suspicion. And Sokolov says that, it's kind of a totality of circumstances, right? To kind of justify this. And what you can do is kind of talk to people. When you go through TSA, you have to give them your stuff anyway, right? And so if you're doing all of these things, when you're talking to the TSA people, they can pull you into a more detailed screening at the airport. And they actually use these things at other places near the border as well, and people are going through border checkpoints. And so those are all things to kind of think through. Make sure that you don't do this kind of stuff because, it might get you red flagged and brought into a back room at the airport where you have to be talked to a little bit more. When I came back from my wedding, my wife had some photos and she had some sand where we had put sand together in the thing, and they were going all through the photos and everything, and the sand, they didn't understand the sand, so it was interesting. It was in my wife's luggage though, not mine, so I was just kind of there. I thought it was interesting. We didn't get taken to a back room or anything. They just went through it all right there. I guess it looked strange in the X-ray machine. But anyway, so financial incentives to fight the drug war. Obviously, What happens is not so much when they catch drugs, because drugs, when the police find people with drugs, the drugs have to be destroyed. Usually they're burned. But when they seize money, this is a big incentive for law enforcement agencies because then oftentimes they get to keep it, or at least a good chunk of it. Some of it might go to the other agencies or other entities within that uh, government government body. So, like if it's a city police department, the police department might get half of it, and the other half the city keeps and uses for trash and other sorts of stuff. Um, Other items too, cars and stuff like that. I know that narcotics agents are, very often will take the cars that they seize from drug dealers, and then they'll use them, and they will drive them themselves as their undercover vehicles. Because what better car to use than a former drug dealer's car when you're pretending to be a drug dealer? You don't want to go and ride around in a Dodge Charger that's unmarked as a narcotics officer. Uh, a DEA officer, you'll get made pretty quickly. Anyway, um, so there's a lot of task force here in Cobb County. We have the Cobb County Joint Task Force with the Marietta. I think the Marietta Police actually just left it to try a different approach. As I've said before, they're trying a little bit more of a public health approach towards addiction and stuff rather than the enforcement approach. And the chief has caught a little bit of flack for that. But there are still many other Powder Springs Police, Ackworth Police, Kennesaw Police, Cobb County Police are all in this multi-jurisdictional task force for drugs in Cobb County. And you'll often see high intensity drug trafficking areas that can be created. What they're often doing too is assigning DEA agents to work with departments. And so some officers can actually become DEA agents that are still part of their department, but then they get access to all of the DEA databases and everything like that, which is very helpful for enforcing the drug use and seeing how things are getting access to information and intelligence about how things are going on outside of their jurisdiction can be quite helpful. So getting communication between, for example, the Cobb County Police Department and the Kennesaw Police Department, or the Kennesaw Police Department and the Ackworth Police Department about ongoing things tends to be very helpful in sharing that intelligence because oftentimes drug dealers are not just staying in one city. The people that deal drugs in Ackworth are happy to go to Kennesaw too and various other cities, right? So that's an important thing to talk about. Um, Interestingly, when people get shot, they will often go to a hospital that's outside the jurisdiction where they got shot at because they know that if they go to the hospital with a gunshot wound, then uh, I'm sorry, the doctors have to notify the police that they treated a gunshot wound, and the police will come and question you and stuff like that. And it's harder for them to link the shooting victim to the actual crime when it's outside of the jurisdiction. Although it still happens, it's just a little bit more challenging. If you go to the hospital in the jurisdiction where the shooting occurred, then obviously they know exactly what happened most of the time. Anyway, um, so SWAT teams have been around since the 1980s. They started using them more and more to conduct drug raids. You all have seen this stuff in the news lately, I'm sure, with people being shot in their own homes by the SWAT teams and things like that. Um, just recently, as I'm recording this video, there was a guy that was trying to get away in his car, and the police shot and killed him. And they were doing a raid there too. He was just trying to run away, which you're not supposed to shoot people as they're running away or driving away because they're not a threat to you anymore. But anyway, that's what happened, and we'll see what happens there. Um, there's a lot of money behind this. The police departments have been given a lot of military equipment, 1.2 million pieces of it in 1997 from military surpluses, essentially. Some departments have Humvees and APCs, which is armored personnel carrier, for those of you that don't know. and various other items. They started carrying AR-15s, uh, other things like that. I still, some of them will use grenade launchers, but they don't actually fire the grenades at civilians. Luckily, they're using them more to fire tear gas and stuff like that. So, these are all things that have kind of contributed to, this militarization of the police and the militarization of these drug raids that have been occurring since the 1980s as well. Um, so I've kind of already talked about the racial disparities in arrests, and just to give you all a couple of high points about this, there was Operation Hammer in 1989. It was in the LAPD. It arrested 1,000 people for drug offenses in one weekend, but they're all black or Hispanic. They didn't arrest a single white person, which is interesting, right? In New York City, you had a very similar issue, and almost all of them were minorities as well. Um, so these are all things to think about, with regard to the racial disparities in drug arrests. It's quite concerning, frankly. Um, especially when you look at the data that shows that usually white people are using more drugs than other people, black or brown people are. Um, so so there's three explanations for why blacks are more likely than whites to be arrested. Blacks use drugs at higher rates, which I just told you wasn't really true. Blacks sell drugs at higher rates. And police arrest and target blacks disproportionately. Um, so, like I said, do blacks use drugs at higher rates? Evidence suggests that they do not. Do blacks sell drugs at higher rates? Evidence suggests they don't do that either. So then what's going on? Well, it must be the third explanation. Do police arrest and target blacks more likely, or more likely than whites for drug offenses? Yes, that is kind of the explanation there, right? If you look at a few explanations, um, Michelle Alexander has a great book, which I highly recommend that people read. Um, and trying to remember the name of it. The New Jim Crow is by Michelle Alexander, and I would recommend you all check that out. It's pretty interesting. I think I have a video somewhere where she talks about the book, and I think it might be a TED Talk or something. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and I can send you that. I know you all like to just watch the videos instead of read the book. Uh, I was an undergraduate student once too, so I'm aware of these things. But anyway, and Tonry has a good take on this too. Essentially, police invest more energy in arresting people in inner cities and on the streets. If you're standing on the street doing drugs, then you're more likely to be caught than if you're in your home, right? And if you're in the inner city, it's easier to be caught than if you're out, on a 5-acre ranch using drugs. Even if you are outside, right? Because the police aren't going to be going and looking to see what you're doing on your own ranch most of the time, I guess, unless they're called there, right? And so, if you live in the inner city, you're just so happen to be more likely to be arrested for pretty much anything because you're going to have more interaction with the police, right? Because of the streets and sidewalks and stuff, there's just not really many places to get away. And so, these things, when you use drugs in kind of the city, you're more visible to the police. We like to call this low hanging fruit for the police because it's so easy to just go through a big city and find people in possession of drugs. And so it's kind of not really a challenge for the police. It's easy arrests for them, and it's easy for them to get promoted. If you see your narcotics detective, they'll make way more arrests than your other detectives, your vice detectives, or even especially your homicide detectives. And that's good though because that means there's not that many homicides. Um, so Michelle Alexander is kind of a little bit different of a take and argues that the drug war efforts are actually aimed at black communities. That this whole thing is created in order to kind of control black and brown people in our society, and so and it gets at the idea that these are easy arrests. So look at your textbook and then tell you more about these things too. But I'm just under 30 minutes, so I'm going to stop there so I don't go on too far. And that was the last slide too. So I'll talk to you all next time and have a good day.